Okay, in this video tutorial, what we're going to cover is using text as a clipping mask with the clipping function in Photoshop. So just for the sake of the tutorial, I went ahead and already prepped my document for the images I'm going to be using. So let's just review those. So I started out with an open canvas 8x10 photo intent landscape orientation. Then I brought in an image of Mount Everest, an image of Bora Bora Island, and then I added a point type text layer and I wrote land and sea in Rockwell extra bold. So the reason why I use these three images is obviously for the text concept. I want to move one of my images across so that I have a sea type image that's going to be inside the word sea, and then land type image in the word land, and then through the word and we're going to have a transition of the images blending into one another. But first, let's just talk about the layer structure. So unlike clipping masks in the other software where the clipping mask is on top, our type is going to act as the clipping mask. So in Photoshop, clipping masks or clipping layers are underneath the layers you want to be clipped to them. So what I do is I put the type on first so that I can align everything where I want it to clip. Then I clip the images to the text and then reorganize as needed. So what I'm going to do is move my images so they're kind of in a proper place. So I'm going to leave some, I'm going to check my auto select function and then click the Bora Bora Island image, and I'm going to have it over the word and move it up a little bit so that the horizon line is going through the middle of the letters like that. So this will be my blending space. So I'm leaving island image over and then I'm going to take Mount Everest and line it up so the same thing is happening but the opposite. So I'm making this line end on the D, so I have good transition space there. But then let's see if I make the mountains and the peaks of the mountains go through like this a little bit so that it matches the horizon there. So now once I get everything lined up on my text, because my text is line centered both vertically and horizontally, now I can reposition my layers in the layers panel to work for the clipping function. So now after I get that set up, I take my type layer and I move it beneath Mount Everest. So I move it all the way to the back. Then the clipping function we've already gone over with our adjustment layers, it works the same way, except now these pixel layers will be clipped to the type layer, and by doing so, they will show up where the text is and nowhere else. So in this case, since we're using a clipping mask, your type color does not matter if you're fully filling it with a clipped image or a pixel layer. But in a moment, I'll show you where the color of the text may matter. But since it's a clipping function, doesn't matter if it's black, red, white, whatever it may be, it's just going to clip the image layer to it. So turn those back on, and then I hold down the Option key, hover over the dividing line between Mount Everest and land and sea, and click on it. And notice there it clipped the image right where I had placed it. Then I come up between the Bora Bora and Mount Everest, just like multiple adjustment layers, hold down the Option key, and click on that. So now it clipped the sea area and that horizon line there. So I got that set up pretty good. So now let's say there was some adjustments I wanted to make. I want to see what it looks like to have Mount Everest peak in the word land. I can select on the Mount Everest layer. Then when I come over to my control panel, I can uncheck auto select layer. That way I can now click anywhere in my document and it will only move the layer I have selected. So when I click here, I can now position Mount Everest all around, checking the horizon line, seeing which is more, dynamic or more interesting of a landscape. So I could do it like that. But here's where the text color matters. If I pull my image too far away and the text starts to show back up because my image doesn't fill it, you then get the color of the text, whatever it happens to be. So in this case, it's black, so then a black text shows up. And you can do cool stuff with that because you could have an image just clipped to one word and not all three and do it like that, or position things as needed so that just one word has a letter in it and that sort of thing. But you could do the same thing if you had text on individual layers and just clipping individual parts of the text to the layer. But that's it. So I'm going to reposition it so I have the peak and the A there, so it kind of matches the mountain a little bit. Maybe not as interesting, but we'll just leave it there for sake of tutorial and not get too into the weeds with that. And you could also use your Shift key and your arrow keys once you have the layer selected if you like to leave the auto select feature turned on in your control panel. So now that I have my text and my images organized well, now what I'm going to use is a gradient layer mask to feather the sea part so it shows through a little bit of the Mount Everest area. So since Bora Bora is on the top, I'm going to select that layer. I'm going to come down to the bottom and click Add New Layer Mask. So that gives me a new layer mask. And as always, I'm going to hit my D key to make sure that I have white in the foreground, black in the background. Then I go to my gradient tool. When I go to my gradient tool, you have a number of options in the gradient panel. So you have the preset gradients you can apply, you have linear gradient, radial gradient, you have angular gradient, and then you have reflected gradient and diamond gradient. We're just going to be working with the linear gradient because we're working on a layer mask. We're not using it for a painting or colorizing or mixing color option. So in this case, all I'm curious about is the black values. So you can see in my bar, it goes from white to black. So white reveals, black conceals. So if I come to my A here and click and drag across and release the mouse, you can see what happened on my layer mask. On my layer mask, it went black on the right and white on the left. So there it is. When you click and drag a gradient across your canvas and release it with the layer mask selected, it draws that gradient on the layer mask. So I actually want it to reveal the word C and then slowly blend in to black to reveal the mountains in the middle of and. So I'm just going to click and drag my gradient in the opposite direction and then stop maybe at about the A and then release it. So when I do that, you can see I still got a little bit of that hard line in the Mount Everest image. So I'm going to come over to the S and make it a much more stronger transition and then release it. And then I can finesse that until I get that black line away and then select my Mount Everest layer and then grab my selection tool to move it. And then when I move the Mount Everest layer, you can see how that blends into the C image through the word and. And then if I option click on my layer mask, we can take a look at it and you can see how that blends across. So using layer masks and clipping masks together can create really interesting techniques for blending imagery within text or, for that matter, any kind of layer that is clipped beneath the image layers. So that is clipping pixel image layers to text using the clipping function and then using a layer mask to control the blend of the two images that are clipped beneath the text.